Awesome. Cool. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come to the first of many Unlocking series at Carrot. Before I start, I just want to lay out a soft agenda. The first 45 minutes of the session is going to be dedicated to a Q&A with Dr. Picho. We'll take the last 10 minutes to answer any questions you may have for her. But if you have any questions during the first half, please feel free to drop them in the chat or send them to me. Don't be shy to interact as well with what she's saying in the chat box through emojis. If anything resonates with you, makes you smile, or if you have a thought. And lastly, yeah, it's going to be recorded, as I've mentioned. So if you have to leave early, we got you with a recording. With that, I'll just introduce Dr. Picho. Like I said, the series is called Unlocking Knowledge. And today we're kicking it off with a special guest, Dr. Picho, Dr. Katherine Picho-Kiroga, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Human Development and Psychoeducational Studies at Howard University. She is an applied statistician, qualitative research methodologist and educational psychologist by training, with a doctorate in social and educational psychology from the University of Connecticut. She has consulted for organizations like the World Bank Group and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on various high impact educational projects. She's an expert in survey development and validation and has developed several psychological assessment tools and surveys which are extensively used worldwide. Dr. Picho also developed the first and only integrated measure of social identity threat, which has then been included in the American Psychological Association's database. She's also been working with Carrot and the Brilliant Black Minds team for the past year, advising and leading us as we conducted focus groups and surveys with our candidates while we work towards the interview access gap for Black engineers. On a personal level, she is an honorary FOP, which means friend of Portia's, and someone who I think is such a boss, not only because we both come from East Africa, represent, but because of just getting to know her and how much she advocates and is finding solutions for underrepresented groups. So thank you so much, Dr. Picho, for taking the time to come to Carrot. And I'm sure she's going to set the standard so high for this series. But with that, I will start with the first question, Dr. Picho. Can you please start by telling us a little bit more about where you grew up and what you studied in school?
Okay. So hi, everyone. It's nice to meet you. I'm truly thrilled to be here. It's been great working with Carrot in the past year. It's great to see some friendly faces. So Portia, Gordy, thank you, Dee, for the support and for being here. I was born and raised in East Africa, so born in Nairobi, Kenya, and then raised predominantly in Uganda. And I eventually settled in Canada to pursue my, my undergraduate education. And after my undergrad, by some sort of luck, I think I call it serendipity, I actually got awarded a fellowship. So the fellowship wasn't serendipitous, I put in the work, but the way that I came to know about it was crazy. My mom, who is still back home in Africa, sent me by mail a little pamphlet she had found and said, hey, this organization is actually providing, fellowships, try and apply. And the pamphlet was like dusty, it even had like a footprint on it, So, I was like, oh, okay, I'll just give it a shot. So I ended up actually being one of 8 applicants from a pool of 1,200 people across the globe that was awarded the fellowship to study anywhere in the world, and I chose to move to the United States. So that's how I migrated from Canada to the United States, where so my undergraduate education, I had a Bachelor of Arts in Communications, and I graduated cum laude. I pursued my master's degree in the same from the University of Hartford. And then I rose to the occasion to follow my calling and decided to pursue a degree in psychology at the University of Connecticut. So I consider myself to be a child of the globe, seeing as I have lived on 3 continents, 5 countries. I speak 4 languages fluently, including French, a couple of African Luo and Bantu languages as well. And so I tend to bring this multicultural background or aspect of mine and use that as a lens to inspire the work that I do for research.
Wonderful. Thank you for that background. And so fast forward to today, what is your role at Howard University, and why did you choose to work at an HBCU like Howard?
So I'm currently, as you mentioned in the introduction, assistant professor of educational psychology, and I teach statistics and quantitative research methods. I'm also the director of the RISE lab, which is a lab that I created that advances my research. And so RISE stands for Research in STEM Education, where I work on a couple of projects pertinent to my program of research that are funded by the National Science Foundation. So the reason I picked Howard, I think I would have to give you a little bit of background information. I joined Howard from the Department of Defense. So I was recruited after my PhD program by the US Department of Defense. And that's what really led me to move to Washington, DC. So I was given a joint appointment as the assistant professor of medicine over at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda. And I was also a senior research scientist that was working on a whole bunch of classified things that deal with big data, primarily, but the unclassified things that I can tell you that I was working on was, looking at health outcomes for military students and physicians that are in the military healthcare system. Not sure if you know this, but the military actually has one of the largest, if not the largest, like database tracking literally healthcare of the military personnel. So if the Undersecretary of Defense wanted something and related to that, then I was the go-to person that would kind of like get in the data and do all of that stuff and, work with a team of other statisticians as well, which was fun. So I loved my job, absolutely, because I love statistics. I love modeling. That's awesome. But I was restricted with respect to the fact that I couldn't really conduct my own research. I couldn't really, have my own program of research that was related to what I had actually gone to school for, which really centers around examining how cultural stereotypes concerning the ability of members of marginalized groups have a psychological impact on members of these groups, and trying to find remedies to address this specific situation. So I couldn't really conduct that line of research within this specific environment. And so I knew that after a while, I really just wanted to be an academic and be able to do that. And so Howard came calling, and I thought, what a great avenue, because now I even have access to Black students or students of color, and this would actually significantly be a fruitful endeavor where I'm able to conduct research primarily within this specific context and be able to have more fruitful contributions in terms of helping these students in STEM primarily overcome some of these issues and prepare them essentially for the workforce. So I moved from the DoD, not because, because they weren't great, they were great, but I really just wanted to follow my passion and, use the education that I had received to make a difference.
Awesome. Thank you for the context on your background and where you are today. Just to go back a little bit, here at Carrot, we're always thinking about ways to improve the hiring process. So I'm just curious about your experience with interviews. Tell me about an interview that has changed your life, and it can be either good or bad, because we learn from bad experiences and they leave a mark on us as well. So will you please give us a story?
Yeah, so interviews. The first interview that comes to mind was, I've really been the subject of some really bad interviews. But I think from that, I've actually learned some things that have also helped inspire my research. Before I moved to the United States, I was considering doing an MBA. So I sat the GMAT and I applied around to schools in Ontario, University of Toronto, York University.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. So I applied to get into MBA programs, right? I did the GMAT. And then I got called to an interview at York University. And so I walked into this interview and I was ready, prepared. I'd done the best that I could to prepare. And this woman looked at me as soon as I walked through the door, and she just went. So she had this sneer on her face, and I'm like wondering what's going on? Like, is anything wrong? As far as I was concerned, I was dressed to the nines. I looked good. And I hadn't even opened my mouth to say anything. So I sat down, and she just kind of like, got my resume, looked at it, looked at my statement, began to ask me, why do you want to be in the program? But as she was talking to me, and as I was obviously looking at her, she just had this look on her face that just spelled, you're not a worthy candidate. Like, I don't even know why I'm here, because basically you're wasting my time. She had just the facial expressions were like out of this world. So I did the best that I could. Fortunately, I wasn't unnerved, because I guess I really just felt, you know what, I need to get into the program. So I tend to have this ability to really hyper focus when I want something. And so I just, push everything else out of view. But like 5-10 minutes into the interview, she went from, because at one point she even just did while I'm talking. So 5-10 minutes into the interview, then I could begin her countenance began to change, and I could see that the countenance was changing. And so she said she looked a little bit more impressed about the things that were coming out of my mouth. And by the end of the interview, she was all like pleasantly surprised, but also very impressed by, I guess, the way I was answering the questions. And so she said, oh, it was nice to have you. And this time it felt genuine. And I left. And then 2 days later, I got an envelope from FedEx with a FedEx envelope, and I had been admitted into the program. So that was my first interview that made me think, wow, like I literally walked in, hadn't said a word, and somebody had already judged me based on the way that I looked, and felt that I was probably not competent to join their super great program. And the same thing incidentally happened when I had applied into the PhD program at the University of Connecticut. And in that specific situation, there were things that had happened, right? And and I'll share the backstory, because these things are lots of Black students basically go through this, not the same, but probably even worse case scenarios. I had a roommate that I was living with. She brought her mother to live with us, but the mom was an addict and all of this stuff. And the night before I literally went to do the GREs, this woman got in a full-blown fight with her significant other who had come by. The cops were called. I was so traumatized because I'd never been exposed to something like this. So I didn't sleep at night because I was all afraid. I go to do my GRE exams. I'm sleep deprived. I'm traumatized. I don't know left from right. So I ended up still performing well. I think I got about 1,100, but I think the admissions for this specific program at the UConn, because that specific, they have top 20 public schools, public universities annually, but I think that year, they were like number 18 or something. So they had this, they didn't want to, lower their statistics. And so you had to get 1,200 or something. And so I kind of wrote them a letter and try to explain my situation. And they brought me in for an interview. And, again, I was experiencing the same things that were very reminiscent of what I had experienced when I was in Canada. Mm-hmm. And so I got in. I ended up getting into the program, but later on, I kind of found out that they were concerned, right? Like, is she really going? Actually, they had me redo the GRE, take the GRE again, because we can't take below like 1,200 or whatever, which I did under better circumstances, and I was able to, meet that extra 100 points that they wanted. But basically, what I later found out was that they were concerned. Is she really going to make it? Because, there was this black woman who was in the PhD program, and she dropped out last year. And so, that ended up having to be the situation that they were concerned about, whether I was going to be able to thrive in the program or this and that, which, I eventually, I thrived. Mm-hmm. And so in both of these really bad, these interviews, I think there was still like an opportunity for me to, they still were life-changing in the sense that believe it or not, I was actually given a chance, if you really think about it. Because in the first interview, when this woman looked at me and had already decided I wasn't a worthy candidate, she could have shut herself off, right? And just kind of made the interview short and left, but she actually allowed herself the opportunity to be open to the things that I had to say. And that was able to kind of change her mind and the way she perceived me, which ultimately got me an admissions into the MBA program. In the second scenario, interviewing for this, to join this doctoral program, despite the concerns about the other Black woman who, was admitted and then she ended up like dropping out after a year, and their concerns around that, I think I'm still grateful because I was still given an opportunity in spite of that, in the sense that they were willing to see me as an individual eventually, right, at the end of their little discussion, being able to see me and my merits as an individual and not necessarily see me as a member of a group for which these negative stereotypes tend to apply. So the only positive interview that actually changed me, I would say, would be one where I was applying for an internship to work at the mayor's office in Hartford, Connecticut. And the director of communications scheduled a phone interview, and then there would be like an in-person interview. And so during the phone interview, I got so nervous at some point, then the phone dropped, because it was one of those landline phones. Like my phone literally dropped and hung up, and I was devastated, to say the least. I'm like, oh my God, I screwed up. I don't know what I'm gonna do. But she called me back and we continued the interview, and I'm like, that's it. She's never going to call me for a face-to-face interview, but she actually did. So she called me for a face-to-face interview. I ended up getting the job. And to this day, Sarah has been a positive influence in my life, because she didn't just hire me to be a gopher, like, oh, go get me tea, go get me this and that. She actually involved me in the process of writing speeches for the mayor and, developing like these TV programs, and just pretty much giving me the line experience that I needed to make sure that I would be successful once I left the internship. So those are my experiences generally. 2 bad interviews, 1 good interview, but I think the common thread that lies beneath all of that is the fact that I was given a chance to actually, demonstrate my competency. Yeah.
I think you hit on so many great points there, or just like real life scenarios where you were saying like something happened to you the night before with your neighbor, and that's just like uncontrollable for you. So like the person on the other side has to be, I think as hiring managers or interviewers, like we just have to know that people are human and that like things happen that are out of our control, right? And so first of all, check your bias at the door. Like you can't come in already judging someone based on what they appear as, right?
Yeah.
And then second of all, just always having, ready to give someone an opportunity. Like you said, the common thread is an opportunity that they provided you with. So I think those are really great nuggets for us.
Yeah.
Shifting. Yeah.
And I was going to say that you took the words right out of my mouth, right? Checking your bias at the door, but also being reflective as an individual to kind of think about what potential biases, you might have, what impact it might have on your comportment when you are with an interviewee, and what those potential consequences might be. Because then I think that when you conduct an interview, you're probably going to be a little bit more mindful about these things. And how potentially your own biases might be influencing the decisions that you might be making about a specific candidate.
Exactly, because you have the opportunity to change someone's life, right? So I think that's really valuable. Shifting gears a little to the work that we did together on the interview access gap report. I'm curious, why were you interested in working with Carrot on this project?
Because Carrot is doing pretty much what I was inspired to do, but they're doing it at a different angle. They're trying to find what these gaps are and trying to bridge these gaps to be able to give members of underrepresented groups the opportunity, a level playing field, essentially, which is pretty much aligned with what I am trying to do as well. So I was very excited. And especially knowing that interviewers are gatekeepers. So you can get kept out of getting into a field or getting and advancing to a higher level And being able to see what you guys are doing with the brilliant Black minds, and being able, trying to impact these skills, both soft skills and technical skills to prepare the students. I think there's no better way to do it than doing that exactly.
Yep, I agree. And I think there was one quote, Dr. Picho, that you mentioned. It's about like getting to the problem at the root. I don't know if you remember the quote off the top of your head, but I think it's super powerful for everyone to hear.
Yes. So that's the other thing that's special about Carrot, right? So most companies today are doing, they have all these policies on DEI, diversity, inclusion, and all of that, equity, inclusion, and all of that. And so in doing that, sometimes, when there's that push to be able to fill a quota, if you're just hiring a candidate to fill a quota, it could actually have very detrimental consequences for both the candidate and the company. Because now it's like, oh, okay, well, Portia just needs 10 people of color to be interviewed. And out of this year, we need to be able to hire like maybe 5% of our workforce is people of color. So now HR is literally trying to fill in the quota. But if you're only concerned about filling in the quota without really thinking about the underlying issues that are potentially like impacting these individuals and understanding, why they are underrepresented, why we're not seeing most of them in these specific spaces, then we're really trying to treat the symptom, but not necessarily the disease is another way that I would put it. Because filling a quota just for the sake of filling in a quota is pretty much also the underlying assumption there is that, well, it's disempowering, as a matter of fact, because then you're assuming that these individuals that you are hiring from these underrepresented groups may not be as competent, but what are we going to do? We need to just kind of have a couple of faces in our company that represent, Black, Latina, and females as well, for example, in STEM or in technology. So that's almost giving a handout, but these members of underrepresented groups do not need necessarily a handout. Okay, so with little training in key areas that are critical to success in the industry, I'm pretty sure that they have the capacity and the willingness to roll up the sleeves and get the work done to get them to where they need to be. But the problem is, very often in life, is that there tends to be what I think of as a hidden curriculum, right? So there is a way that things are done within the industry, but as an outsider, you may not be aware of what those things are. And so this hidden curriculum, those that have the in terms of how things are done and what's needed to be successful, those are the people that are likely to get in the door and flourish. But as we saw with our report that we did, the study that we did with the Howard, Morehouse, and UNC students, we know that they lacked exposure. We know that they knew very few people in tech, but we also knew that just knowing 3 or 4 people made a tremendous impact with respect to individuals being confident in their ability to succeed in these technical interviews. Because guess what? It's these insiders that are able to kind of give you what the hidden curriculum is. They're able to kind of tell you what these things are that are critical to success that you really need to be focusing on. And so here's where Carrot comes in my view at least, is that rather than giving a handout, you are actually giving a handout, which is what members of marginalized groups need. We need to be empowered. We need to be viewed from a position of strength, knowing that you're capable of doing these things, but also being able to get to the root of why are we seeing these gaps? What are some of the things that we can do to bridge these gaps? And then literally being able to enforce those things. So by providing these technical interviews, we know that the students lack exposure. They've been exposed to some things, CS education later on in life. And even as they are in school, some of these things are taught way later. And then the concept of even knowing what a technical interview is lost in a whole number of students because they're just not exposed. And so they get called into an interview, think it's a behavioral interview or other type of interview that they are used to, and then they get slapped with, you have to code. And then suddenly you're like, oh my God, I didn't know I had to code. Now I'm anxious. And all these other things, kick in and make the experience of technical interviewing, very anxiety ridden. And so by being able to provide opportunities to Black students or minority students and women in this specific tech space where we know that they are underrepresented, being able to provide them with the skills that they need to be competitive enough is actually very empowering. It's giving them a hand up as opposed to a hand out, right? And so addressing these issues at the root is now treating the actual disease, which is why, that quote by Henry David Thoreau really came to mind, right? So for every 1,000 that's just like really trying to, hack at the leaves of evil, you guys are actually really hacking at the root because you're addressing the key underlying issues that are responsible for these gaps.
Yeah, no, that's really, I love that hand out versus hand up analogy that you made there. And I think it's so important to also keep in mind, like there's so many layers to it. Like you said, like it's not just, hey, here, take some practice interviews. It's, hey, what else do you need to supplement that? Do you need you need some like a network to a Black community in the tech industry? Do you need supplemental like office hours? Like there's just so much more than just giving someone a handout of like, hey, here, do this, where there's just like not that insider knowledge. And so I'm glad that you hit on that, and that's exactly what we're trying to do at Brilliant Black Minds. So thank you.
Yeah.
One of the more fascinating studies, and you mentioned a couple from the Interview Access Gap report, the one that I want to bring up that's I think really tied to your study as well is about social identity threat and imposter syndrome and stereotype threat. But we found in the Access Gap report that earlier access to computer science results in lower levels of imposter syndrome. But further, we learned that Black women in the study face compounding effects of gender and racial bias in white male-dominated spaces. Therefore, right, women reported feeling extreme levels of interview anxiety twice as more frequently as their male counterparts. So beyond these statistics, I know that social identity threat and stereotype threat are things that you faced in your career, like we talked about it earlier. But I would like first, can you explain in your terms what stereotype threat, what social identity threat mean, and how they've affected you throughout your career, but also how they can affect a candidate throughout the hiring process?
Well, so imposter syndrome is really just a psychological phenomenon where individuals constantly doubt their skills, their talents, their abilities, and they think they're a fraud, right? So they always have this internalized fear that they will be found out, and that they're not somehow, somewhere, whatever achievement that they get is due to, whatever success that they achieve is due to lack. But with stereotype threat or social identity threat, I actually prepared a couple of slides because I had this conversation with your CEO, co-CEO Jeff last week, and I promised I would share a couple of things. I came a little bit prepared for the social identity threat part of things. And so stereotype threat or social identity threat really more broadly is this psychological phenomenon that is experienced in contexts that signal to individuals very subtly or maybe even overtly that by belonging to a specific group, you are devalued. So we do have these cultural stereotypes around gender or around race and ability specifically. So you probably have had the whole idea, oh yeah, women aren't that good in numbers, for example, right? So women tend to freak out when they have to perform simple arithmetic operations. And a lot of research has been done in this specific area. Same thing with the whole idea that, well, African Americans are really not as intelligent as their white counterparts. And so when individuals feel that their membership, either as a woman or as a person of color, is being perceived in a negative light, then they experience a whole bunch of psychological things that actually impact their ability to do well. So when this threat is experienced in an evaluative setting, like with interviews or performing an actual exam like the GREs or the SATs and all of that, then the impact on performance is actually debilitating for some members. And that is contingent on a couple of things. So I'm going to kind of walk you through how this whole stereotype threat process works. So we imagine, and let's just say we imagine we have Maggie. So if there's anyone here called Maggie, I'm not talking about you. I just threw a name out of a hat right now, so forgive me. Let's just say we have Maggie. She's sitting a GRE quant standardized test at the moment. But as she's doing that, maybe she's sitting in a group setting and all she's seeing are like white guys or Asian guys, because again, the Asians do have that positive stereotype that they're very intelligent, very smart, especially when it comes to technology or math. And so this poor little Maggie is sitting by herself. And just by virtue of there being very few women sitting in this specific context, perhaps someone says something in the context, or just being, seeing other people that remind her that her group is less than, at least according to the stereotype, Maggie begins to experience a little bit of anxiety about that. And so what happens is that now there is this tension between her identity to the group as a woman, I am like my group, and the conflicting stereotype about the ability. So my group does not have this ability, and I am like my group. But I think I have this ability. So her self-concept, I have this ability, I know I'm good, but is conflicting with the whole group identity, essentially. So this conflict creates psychological cognitive dissonance, which creates anxiety, okay? That anxiety eats up a lot of limited resources in the brain, like your limited working memory, which is really important and critical for being able to solve problems efficiently. So instead of focusing on the assessment, she's focusing on the test, but trying to at the same time manage all of these concerns about her group membership and trying to make sure that she does not confound the stereotype, which leads to inefficient cognitive processing. Maggie ends up not doing well. It's like a really simple question where you could just, use Pythagoras theorem to kind of calculate this whole thing. It's like find X, and Maggie's just saying, well, here is X, right? So Maggie ends up underperforming, which ends up confirming the negative stereotype. But it really wasn't because she didn't have the ability. It's because something happened in the context, within the evaluating context, that actually like triggered a whole chain of reactions that led to this specific moment. And so in the short term, what will happen is that these individuals tend to underperform relative to their ability. So they do have the ability, but they perform less well. So in other words, their performance is not a reflection of their actual ability. And with the CARET report that we saw, right? I think Dr. Baj mentioned this, right? So you begin to sweat, you have anxiety, but all of these things end up being perceived differently by the interviewer, which can only heighten your anxiety, right? So there's a lot of social identity threat going on in these specific instances. Mm-hmm. And then you end up losing the confidence in your ability to excel, which we kind of saw as well with imposter syndrome, just that high level of anxiety just works against your confidence. And so these members also begin to experience a lack of fit in STEM. I just don't feel like I belong, type of thing. So in the long run, they end up probably weeding themselves out of the whole. They end up weeding themselves out of STEM. So I personally have never suffered from imposter syndrome. I've never really felt like I'm a fraud, but I've definitely experienced social stereotype threat on many occasions. The first I can think of that really left an indelible mark in my memory to date, and what really inspired what I'm doing for research, was that we had the British system of education, where after elementary school we literally have high school split into two. So you have what you call ordinary level that goes through grade 11, then you sit the national exams, and then when you pass grade 11, then you are admitted to like a higher secondary education, right, which is advanced level. And so in advanced level, what you do is, with in your lower secondary, you take up to 12 courses and all of that, sciences, arts, and all of that. At the advanced level, you only take courses that are pertinent to your career track. So when I took the O levels, I did well on everything. So, you know, I could choose pretty much whether I wanted to follow the track for arts or the track for sciences. And so I chose the track for sciences because I wanted to be, believe it or not, a medical doctor. So today I would probably be Dr. Picho-Kiroga, MD, right? But what happened was that when I got admitted to I was allotted physics, chemistry, math, biology. That was my track because I wanted to be a doctor. But the moment I decided that I wanted to be a doctor, my whole life changed, and not for the better, because suddenly everybody was looking at me like, what? Don't you want to do like communications? You're a very good writer. You'd make a very good writer. Why do you want to do a subject for guys? Because again, when you think about the African cultural setting, right, the gender roles are very distinct. And so gender stereotypes are very prevalent and they prevail. So everybody, even, and this wasn't meant to be a slight to me in any way. I mean, everybody, you know, just, it wasn't with bad intentions, but people were genuinely surprised that I actually wanted to do sciences. Like, why would a woman want to do sciences? And in fact, some of them said, you want to do math? You're going to go crazy. That's a subject for guys. Mm. So I began to hear these messages constantly, and I began to doubt my own ability to actually excel, even though I had done well enough to be admitted in the program. So my confidence plummeted. I was doubting myself. I would go, you know, I did great on homeworks. Mm-hmm. When I had to do an exam, oh my God, like the results would come back. And in fact, my physics teacher told me one time, a male, my physics mister, I don't remember his name. He told me, you look so bright, but your results really don't show it. And that's the thing, right? Like people in Africa are very not politically correct. They just say what they think. So he told me that I looked bright, but this was not reflected in my performance. And like the rest of the people laughed. And that just made me feel worse about myself. And I'm like, oh my God, I really have set myself up to fail. Maybe I should go do literature, because everyone hears, so why don't you go do literature or something? Maybe you belong in the arts class. You know, mm-hmm. So for 2 years, I went through some psychological stuff that I couldn't really explain. I felt so alone. I felt very alienated. I felt like I really didn't belong in STEM anymore. My results, I was like, when I would get the papers back, I'd be like, of course, this is what it was. But in that moment, when I was actually doing the test, I couldn't really, there was just a disconnect. There was like a blockade somewhere. I couldn't understand what was going on. So I passed my advanced level exams, and then I said, okay, I'm going to apply for medicine. I'm going to apply to pharmacy school and all of this other stuff. I did get admitted to pharmacy school in the UK, actually. But at that point, like the burden of always having to prove that as a woman, I could excel in STEM, the burden of always trying to, you know, prove to myself that, you know, I wasn't dumb, that I could actually, you know, do this, it wore me down. So I got admitted to pharmacy school. I was like, you know what? I'm not going to pharmacy school, because the thought that I would have to go through 3 more years of what I had just experienced was not my cup of tea at all. Mm-hmm. So I weeded myself out of STEM, essentially. I said, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and do like mass communications, because everybody thinks I'm a good writer, which I am, but I mean, that's not really a reason. You should really be doing something that you're passionate about. So I kind of like went into a track where it was more acceptable for me as a woman to be. And hence that's kind of why I, you know, moved to Canada to try to start a whole new life, do communications, where if I told people, oh yeah, I'm doing communications, people would be like, oh great, like nobody would question me anymore. And that was that. But when I hit Canada, and this is my second experience with Stereotype Threat, I walked into my first year. I graduated from the University of Ottawa, but my first year was in Edmonton, University of Alberta. And the Western Canada is really homogeneous, just predominantly white, okay? So I went to my intro to psychology class. It was like an amphitheater with like 250 people, you know? I walked into this class and I freaked out for 2 reasons. One, when I was in high school, I remember one time the Dean of Studies came to us. I think there was a bunch of white people had come to the school to talk to us and this and that. I don't know where they came from, probably the UK or America. And I remember this guy, our dean of studies, saying, oh, the Bazungu are here. So that's Swahili for like white person, right? So the Mzungus are here to see you guys. You need to behave because these guys literally invented knowledge. So that kind of stuck in my head, right? I didn't even realize that it had stuck in my head. But when I walked into this psych class, because, you know, when you invent knowledge, it means you know it all, basically. So he's telling us, oh, you need to behave. These guys, this white, this Bazungu, they literally invented knowledge. I'm like, whoa, you know? So we behaved, we blah, blah, blah. But now I was kind of seeing the white person as like, these are the inventors of knowledge, right? So I walk into my Psych 101 class and I freaked out because I saw like 200, I was pretty much almost the only dot in the room, if you know what I mean. Like the one Black person, it's like a whole bunch of white faces. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I'm going to fail. I think I'm going to fail. Like I automatically, I think, associated, like, look at all the children of these inventors of knowledge in a class with me, right? This individual from Africa. And I had just experienced this whole stereotype threat. And at that point, I still didn't even know that it was stereotype threat. And so I was like freaking out. But then when I went back to my dorm that day, I sat down, I was trying to calm myself down. And I remembered my uncle. My uncle's a very brilliant guy. When we were at the airport before we took off on the plane, my mom was like, bye, do us proud, blah, 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 this and that. My uncle called me to the side and he said to me, and he spoke to me in our language. So usually, if you're bilingual, English, and you have another language, at least in our cultural context, when a parent speaks to you in the language, you know they can speak English, but they're speaking, then they're really trying to emphasize something. And my uncle said to me, go and do well. Don't be intimidated by white people. That's what he told me. He's like, don't be intimidated by white people. They're just like you and me. The color of the skin is different. They breathe the same, eat the same, believe the same. So don't let anyone make you feel that you're not intelligent or that you're less than because you're going to be around white people. And that, I think, really saved me, because when I was in my dorm after that first lecture and I remembered what my uncle told me, I was able to hold on to that. Yeah. And I said, okay, I'm going to test this hypothesis, I guess. I'm going to do the best that I can this semester and see what happens. And I held on to the words that my uncle spoke to me. You know, my father passed away when I was really young. So he was like my role model, and he's a successful and brilliant mathematician. And so I believed what he told me, essentially, and I held on to that. So at the end of the semester, I ended up with a 4.0 GPA, and I was on the dean's list. And I think like that kind of dissipated my social identity threat, stereotype threat from that time on. But it took being able to have a role model, someone that I looked up to, tell me not to be intimidated. Because then at that point in time, you could think I had two conflicting views. One about, oh, these white guys are the inventors of knowledge. So therefore, you know, they invented, they know it all. So you don't know anything, you're going to fail. Or I could choose to believe what my uncle said to me. But that was just me. There's so many Black students at HBCUs and outside HBCUs who don't even have that role model, who don't even have someone that could mentor them. And the worst part of it all is, you know, I was coming from Africa where we have, you know, everybody's Black, so we don't have those race stereotypes. But if you've been born and raised in a country like the United States or in Canada, then you've been exposed to these race stereotypes from the time that you were young. And so many times, given different background situations or the family background situation, most people may not be as lucky to have a mentor or someone they can look up to who can tell them that things are different. And so they end up believing the narrative, which then ends up playing out when they get into the industry. Yeah.
Agreed. A lot of love for your uncle in that chat too. And how important is it to have someone speak life into you, especially as an underrepresented minority? And I think it's so powerful that those two like different views and what you chose to accept as true is super important, and it's very needed as well. And I think that's why mentorship is something that we're trying to lead into as well for candidates. But I just kind of want to switch gears to your research right now, because I know you're innovating strategies to combat social identity threats. because again, we can't control the biases that are thrown at us in this world, but we can control how we react to them. So can you please talk a little bit more about that?
So yes, so the first thing that I'm doing right now, which was the research that I'm doing that's been funded by the National Science Foundation, is that I developed an intervention to reduce stereotype threats among people of color, and it's based off of the stereotype threat model, right? So the picture that I just showed you, or like with Maggie, can really be reconceptualized this way. We have your self-concept, your idea of who you are, that's tied to the domain. I like STEM. I identify with being an engineer, but then I'm also a woman and I identify as a woman or as a Black person. And these identities, these social identities tend to be for members of marginalized groups where the stereotypes apply, they tend to kind of be like in opposition to each other. So what happens is that there ends up being some sort of tension in the identity because it's conflicting, which, as I mentioned to you, elicits negative emotions that impact your working memory, that degrade your task performance. So with the intervention it's called STRIP, really, the Stereotype Threat Reduction Intervention Program, it tries to address stereotype threat at two different levels. One, by teaching metacognitive skills in an attempt to dissolve this tension in the identities, because when there's the tension between these identities, now rather than focusing on the task at hand, people become more vigilant about monitoring the environment for any cues that might signal to them that they don't belong and that the stereotype is true. So your self-monitoring or self-regulatory monitoring regulatory processes get hijacked in the process. And so the intervention focuses on teaching the metacognitive skills and getting them so ingrained in the individual that they're able to actually, in this specific context, overcome the whole self-monitoring that's due to the stereotypes. And the second thing is that the intervention actually teaches emotion regulation skills, because once you begin to experience anxiety, even in an interview, how are you going to respond? How are you going to regulate the anxiety that you're feeling, right? So by teaching research or evidence-based emotion regulation strategies that have been shown to actually down-regulate emotions and improve performance under high anxiety contexts, this is what the STRIP intervention is doing. So I've been conducting this study actually with computer science and engineering students at Howard University. I just finished my last session like 3 weeks ago, and so I should be analyzing the data in the spring. The second thing that I am looking at is repackaging this whole emotion regulation component of the STRIP model and using it in gaming, right? So I also developed a serious game. It's like an educational game. And so this was actually inspired by you guys at Carrot and my previous work at the DoD, because we did a lot of military medical simulations and so on and so forth. So this serious game features or centers around a candidate that's invited to a technical interview at like a tech company. And so the, the game is designed to invoke stereotype threats from the beginning, the moment the individual walks into the campus to the time they literally sit and get interviewed by like the panel. And then they have to actually complete like a quantitative, test, which is really a working memory test, essentially. And so I want to give props to Portia Kibble-Smith, because I wrote the scripts and then I actually validated it with executives in tech companies and other in tech companies primarily. So I reached out to Portia. She helped me, give out the survey, and I got like great results from the survey. And there were primarily, I think 80% were like in big tech. Then the other 20% were doing AI, I think, and software engineering, at least that's what they labeled. But, when I asked them about the experiences in the interview. One of them actually said, yeah, like there was an interviewer who refused to believe that he could go to school full time and work as a developer full time. So the interviewer just said, cut, and stopped the interview. And it was a panel of interviewers. And the guy who stopped the interview was like the highest ranking interviewer, and he wouldn't let the other interviewers interview him. So again, it's all about, what are the biases we have, and how do they come to play in the interview process when you see people that you think, well, that's a Black person, and don't think they have the capacity to actually be a developer full-time, go to school for a master's degree full-time, that kind of thing. But back to the game. So the game has been validated. I'm working with a couple of other academics at UC Santa Cruz over there near Silicon Valley. We've developed this game. I'm showing you some mood boards for my game like this, right? And so the key ideas around here are, I want to know, can gaming really invoke social identity threat? And this is important because, again, if we think about making change, Carrot's doing its part by trying to hack at the root, knowing that I have to start at the base by building these technical skills while these guys are students before they go to their first interviews. I'm looking to mitigate stereotype threat way before, like early in childhood, right? And we know that gaming is what kids do these days. So are there cues that can promote sexism? I think yes. Racism, yes, in gaming. But now I'm really focused on social identity threat. Can we use a game like this where someone has to go to an interview? And can we manipulate the environment and the social interactions to invoke stereotype threat? Because if we can, then we can use the same modality to actually address stereotype threat. So what we're also doing is collecting physiological data like heart rate variability to be able to see where like the heart rate spikes, where there's the most anxiety as they go through this game, and then eventually use biofeedback to be able to, and using the techniques developed from this intervention that I'm currently doing on emotion regulation, like teaching emotion regulation in an app. So again, we want to make sure it's usable across the board, and anyone who has a phone can pretty much download it, use it, and help train themselves using biofeedback to kind of get them to a more regulated state. Can we actually then use that to mitigate stereotype threat? Because the reality is, right, you have to also be able to do something, right? Social identity threat, like sometimes you might find yourself in a situation where it happens. And so when it happens, or when you experience microaggressions, then you have to be able to do something to get yourself to a point where you can perform optimally, regardless of the context and regardless of what the situation is. Yes, we would like people to be more aware. Yes, we would like people to, check their biases at the door. It would be great if they could do that. But in the event that they don't do that, then I think I want to be able to kind of empower people to, to do something for themselves to be able to attenuate stereotype threats. And so this is kind of where I am in terms of my research.
Just quick, I think that your game is cool because me and Dr. Picho were chatting earlier, and some of these like scenarios are real life scenarios that you did research on, right? And so they're not just like theories, they're experiences that me and you may have that really manifest in the workplace. So I'm really excited for this game.
I am too. I'm super duper excited, and I'm actually looking to apply for a career grant to help fund that project. So I'll keep you guys posted, but I think Daniel in the chat, Daniel, I think he agrees that some of this HRV data might be relevant to like future Carrot work as well. So I'd be very happy to keep you in the loop with respect to that.
And that went in, we got a little sneak peek at the next slide. I know we're at 5 minutes until noon, but really quickly, I know I had a couple more questions, but it's okay. I definitely want you to hit on the next slide, which is what are some ways that Carrot can do to minimize stereotype threat to improve the candidate experience?
So at the moment, I'm not very familiar with, but again, that's what drew me to the work with Carrot, because I automatically knew that there were ways that stereotype threat, could be examined with the data that you guys have. So at the moment, without knowing too much about the interviewing process and what really happens, there's certain things that you can do. And I discussed this with, currently Jeff knows a whole lot about this research as well, right? So you can actually request demographics at the end of the interview rather than at the beginning, because the studies show that when you ask for someone's gender or race before an evaluation, then just simply even implying or asking for that is enough to elicit social identity threat. But then you can also reframe the purpose of the interview to the interviewees, right? Because interviewees are, or the candidates tend to usually be anxious. They want to do well. They know that they're going to be evaluated, that their ability is on trial. But, ability on trial, my race, no ability, it activates stereotype threat. So what you can do then is reframe the purpose of the interview to your candidates with less emphasis on evaluating ability or competence, even though that's what you're really doing, but you downplay that and provide an alternate but actual realistic description of what the interview's focus might be. And in the process, also make sure to affirm the interviewee. So I came up with some sort of example intro that, an interviewer could say. So you should know, so Maggie, you should know that, having made it this far in the interview, your ability is not in question. I'm affirming Maggie. So this technical interview has less to do with evaluating your ability. So I'm minimizing that whole evaluative component, but more to do with providing us a little bit more insight into how you solve problems, okay? So really technically with coding, probably you're also looking to see like people's thought process. Because like listening statistics, when I program, I want to be able to see, yes, two people can get at the right coding for programming, but one uses like 100 lines of code, the other one just uses like 3 or 4 or 5 lines of code, right? So one very, more efficient line of coding type of thing. So again, you're providing some sort of context. You're not lying about the purpose of the interview, simply just downplaying the ability thing and providing like a different lens within which you can let them know that you are evaluating them, which tends to really could potentially be helpful.
Great.
So
awesome. Thank you so much. And there's a lot of action happening in the chat where people are already finding ways to integrate this into Carrot. And so this is super valuable information, Dr. Picho. We so appreciate you taking time out of your day. Before we end, we didn't get to questions, y'all, but I definitely want a little bit of fun here. And I have a lightning round questions for Dr. Picho before we leave. Question 1 is, you got 2 seconds to think about it. What book are you reading right now?
So I just finished reading a French novel called Demain, Tomorrow. And it's like a professor at Harvard, he's a widower, lost his wife, and he's like met a woman online and they're chatting, but they're in different timelines, basically. So he's in the future and somehow, somewhere, she's like a year behind him. So it's all about, one of those types of, and then they have to do something to kind of get the timeline synced so that they can meet. So that's the book I just finished reading.
Sounds like a good fiction. Send me the name. If you could fly anywhere in the world, where would you go?
I'd go home.
And where's home? Remind us.
I would go to Uganda, really.
Perfect. And your favorite guilty pleasure food right now?
It's less of food and more like just an appetizer. I'm so obsessed with dinner rolls from Texas Roadhouse. I think they make like the best dinner rolls. I literally just go to the restaurant just for the dinner rolls, essentially. Like, yes, that's made so comforting. I sometimes just order them just for the sake of it. Go pick them up. Yeah.
Well, we're right at noon. Thank you so much again, Dr. Picho, for your time. If you guys have any questions again, please shoot them my way. I will direct them to Dr. Picho. Thank you, Carroteers. And yeah, go forth and carrot, y'all.
Thank you, Dr. Picho.
Thank you, Portia.
You were wonderful as always.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Look forward to working with you more.
Yes, me too. Me too. Oh, yeah.
All right.
Bye.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Picho.
Thank you. Dee, I'm wondering about the chats. I wonder if people had questions that maybe I might answer later on. So I don't know if you can save the chat so I can kind of look through. And if there are questions that were asked, then I can kind of like.
For sure. It looks like people were more so interacting and like adding comments to what you were saying.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was more comments than questions.
Okay.
But Dee, I do expect people will probably and this would be amazing on that TLDR segment on Fridays.
Oh,
if people send enough,
Yeah. I'm gonna